The darkness inside the church seemed denser that night. I was alone, sitting on the pew in front of the altar, watching the faint glow of the candles casting shadows on the stone walls. The city was silent, immersed in the tranquility of the early morning. I had already finished my last prayers of the day, but unlike other nights, something inside me wouldn't let me leave. I have always believed in God. Since I was a child, my mother taught me that faith was the foundation of everything. "Without God, we are nothing," she repeated. These words stayed with me over the years, shaping the person I became. As a teenager, I knew my mission was to serve Him. Becoming a priest was not just a choice, but a calling. At least, that's what I told myself. I spent years in the seminary, immersed in studies of scriptures, theology, and church doctrine. I memorized prayers, learned the rituals, understood what it meant to be a spiritual guide. When I was ordained, I felt that my life had finally found its purpose. I served in a small town in Mexico where faith was intertwined in the daily routine of the people. I baptized children, celebrated marriages, heard confessions, and blessed homes. To everyone, I was an exemplary priest, but inside something was not right. There were moments when I wondered if I really knew God or if I was just following the steps I was taught. Was I leading people to Him or just preserving an institution? The doubt was a weight I carried in silence. After all, a priest was supposed to be a pillar of unwavering faith, not someone who questioned their own belief. That night, this questioning seemed stronger than ever. Sitting in the empty church, I looked up at the large crucifix above the altar. What am I missing? I thought. Why did I feel so distant from Him? I closed my eyes and made a silent prayer, begging for clarity, for an answer. And then it happened. At first, it was just a slight pressure in my chest, nothing alarming, just uncomfortable enough to make me change position. I adjusted my posture, thinking it might just be fatigue, but the sensation grew stronger. The pressure increased like fire, spreading through my ribs. My breathing became shallow. My heart raced, and suddenly all my strength seemed to be drained. My hands trembled as I tried to lean on the pew, but my legs wouldn't obey. The world around me spun. The candle lights seemed to distort into long stripes. A humming filled my ears, muffling the silence of the church. A thought hit me like a shock. I was dying. I tried to speak, to ask for help, but no sound came out. My body was failing, my heart pounding against my chest, and then came the darkness. I don't know how long I stayed there, floating in that void. It could have been seconds, minutes, or even hours. There was no time, no pain, just absolute silence. But then, something changed. A different sensation took over me, as if I were being elevated. Not physically, but in a way I couldn't explain. When my eyes opened, I saw the church from a strange angle. I looked down and saw my own body stretched out on the floor, motionless. Reality hit me like thunder. I was dead. There was no panic, no fear, just a strange silence and an unsettling calm. But this tranquility was soon broken. Something moved in the shadows. At first I thought it was a play of light and darkness caused by the candles, but then I realized I was wrong. The shadows began to take shape. They crawled along the floor, contorting unnaturally, approaching where I was. They had no faces, but I could feel them. The air became dense, colder, laden with a heavy presence. They whispered, words I didn't understand, but whose tone sent shivers down my spine. And then they started to pull me. It wasn't a physical force, but I felt as if I were being dragged. Despair took over me. I tried to fight, but it was like swimming against an overwhelming current. I couldn't escape. They were taking me into the darkness, and in that moment, a real fear gripped me. And then the light came. At first it was just a distant glow, faint like a star in the sky, but it grew, becoming stronger, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The shadows recoiled, hissing, as the light grew around me. Its presence was different from anything I had ever experienced. It was warmth, it was peace, it was love. And in the midst of this light, He was there. A radiant figure, distinct, yet at the same time part of the very light. His face was clear, but it carried something I couldn't fully comprehend. His eyes conveyed unconditional love, but also an authority that made me feel small before him. He took a step forward. "Javier." The sound of my name in his voice was like both thunder and a whisper at the same time. It wasn't just a call, it was a profound knowing. He knew me. I couldn't speak. What could I say? I had spent my life talking about him, teaching about his ways, preaching his word. But now that I was before him, I perceived the crushing truth. "You have served me," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "but do you really know me?" The impact of the question was like a direct blow to my chest. Of course I knew him. I had spent years studying the scriptures, leading masses, teaching about his sacrifice. But did I really know him? Jesus looked at me tenderly, as if he already knew my answer. "You know about me," he continued, "but have you sought my heart?" The question resonated within me in a way it never had before. My faith had been built on rituals, traditions, and obedience to the church. But had I truly allowed myself to know him beyond that? Tears came before I could hold them back. I didn't know. I thought I was doing enough, I confessed, my voice weak. Jesus approached, placing a hand on my shoulder. The warmth of his touch ran through my being. "You have done many good things," he said, "but faith is not just about what you do, it's about who you are with me." The words pierced my soul. I had dedicated my life to serving him, but without ever truly seeking him. I had followed rules, preserved traditions, maintained the structure of the church, but what about my heart? "It's not too late, Javier." The hope in his voice was like a balm for my soul. The shadows had completely disappeared. The silence around us was not empty, but filled with deep peace. For the first time since I left my body, I did not feel lost. Jesus was looking at me, and his gaze was like an anchor, holding me firmly in the midst of that revelation. "You can know me, Javier," he said. "You can still walk with me, not just for me." His words sounded like an invitation, and at the same time, an impossible call to ignore. My heart seemed to want to explode inside me, and I fell to my knees before him. "Teach me," I asked. "Teach me how to truly know you." Jesus smiled, and then the environment around us began to change. The light transformed, and suddenly I was no longer in that intangible space. Instead, I began to see scenes of my own life unfolding before me. As if I were watching from outside, I saw moments of my ministry passing before my eyes. There I was, blessing a family's new home. The mother held her baby with a look of gratitude as I sprinkled holy water and recited the words of the prayer. At the time, I felt satisfied, convinced that I was bringing God's presence to that house. But seeing the scene now, I realized I had rushed through the blessing, worried about my next appointment. Another scene emerged. I was at the pulpit, preaching to a full church. I spoke about obedience and faith, the words coming out with conviction. But now, observing with different eyes, I saw the faces of the congregation. Among them were those who not only listened, but longed for something more. People who carried pain, doubt, loneliness, seeking an answer. But I did not see them at that moment. Each scene that unfolded added a greater weight to my heart. I had followed the structure of my role, fulfilled the rituals, obeyed the traditions. But how many times had I truly seen the people before me? "Do you see now, Javier?" Jesus asked. "Faith is not about the rituals you perform, but about the love you live." The words penetrated deeply. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. The truth he was showing me was painful, but undeniable. Then new images appeared, but this time they were different moments. Small instances that I hadn't given much importance to at the time, but now I understood them as something greater. I saw myself holding the hand of an elderly woman who had just lost her husband. I said nothing, just stayed beside her, listening to her cry, sharing her pain. I saw myself in the last moments of a young man's life in the hospital, surrounded by his family. I was there, holding his hand, praying for him. I saw myself helping a humble farmer repair the roof of his house destroyed by a storm. The work was arduous. My hands were full of blisters, but I stayed until it was finished. "These are the moments when you truly knew me," Jesus said, "not because of what you did, but because of the love you put into it." My heart tightened. For the first time, I realized that knowing Jesus didn't just mean studying about him or following his rules. It meant living like him, loving like him, seeing people as he sees them. Jesus took a step forward, his expression full of tenderness. "I do not condemn you, Javier. I know your heart. But now that you see the truth, you need to make a choice." My breath caught in my throat. "You can continue as you were, following traditions, fulfilling rituals, maintaining the structure," he said. "Or you can leave all that behind and truly follow me." The words were like an earthquake within me. To follow Christ, truly. Not just as a religious leader, but as someone who knew him, who walked with him, who guided others not by rules, but by love. There was no turning back after that. "I want to choose you," I said, emotion overflowing in my voice. "I want to truly know you. I want to live for you." Jesus smiled. "Then follow me, Javier. Trust me, and I will guide every step you take." In that moment, an indescribable peace overcame me. All the doubts that had once tormented me were replaced by an undeniable purpose. The light around us began to transform again. I could feel that my journey there was coming to an end. I was being pulled back, but this time, I knew I would not return as the same man I had been before. Jesus looked at me one last time before the light dissipated. "Remember, Javier, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know, and I have always known you." These words were etched into my soul. And then, the light disappeared. The first thing I noticed when I returned was the sound of voices. They were distant at first, but gradually became clearer. My chest was heavy, my body weak, but I was alive. I opened my eyes, blinking against the fluorescent light above me. The sound of machines around me beeped softly. A nurse leaned over me, relief etched on her face. "Father, you're awake." Awake. The word carried a different weight now. I was not just physically awake, I was spiritually awake. The memories of the experience were still vivid within me, as real as the hospital where I now found myself. The doctors talked about a heart attack. They said I almost died, that it was a miracle I survived. But I knew it wasn't just luck. In the days that followed, as I recovered, I tried to share my experience. I told other priests what had happened, what Jesus had shown me, but most dismissed my words, saying they were hallucinations caused by the stress of impending death. "Don't read too much into it," one of them said with a condescending smile. But I couldn't ignore what I had lived. So I began to talk to the parishioners. Some listened attentively, their eyes full of new hope. "Father," a woman asked me, her voice trembling, "do you think Jesus is really calling us to something different?" I smiled, feeling the truth resonate within me. "Yes," I replied, "he is calling all of us, not to follow rituals blindly, but to truly know him." And so began my new mission. When I returned to the church, I knew things couldn't be the same as before. I couldn't just lead masses and perform rituals without truly seeing the people. I began to listen to them, to walk alongside them in their faith. I spent more time with the sick, the poor, those who felt lost. My sermons changed. I no longer spoke about following the church, but about following Christ. Some people embraced this change and said they had never felt so close to God. Others resisted, clinging to the traditions they had known all their lives. But I was not there to force anyone. I was there to guide. The doubts that once haunted me were replaced by an unwavering certainty. I now knew that my mission was not to preserve an institution, but to point people to Jesus. That night, alone in the church, I knelt before the altar and made one last prayer. "Lord, help me to show them what you have shown me." And in that instant, I felt his presence. I did not have all the answers, but I knew I was exactly where I was supposed to be. My journey was not over, but for the first time, I was ready.